This is a podcast by the Straits Times.
Having now spoken to many business and HR leaders, I feel that there's a genuine desire from companies to want to promote Singaporeans into top roles. There is a genuine desire. The problem is, they don't have enough Singaporeans that they can select for such roles. And then when I question them why not, they say, well, the kind of people we're looking for, somehow the Singaporeans don't meet that criteria.
Talents with overseas exposure are coveted for their ability to help companies realize their global aspirations. And on the flip side, there is robust appetite among Singapore talents to work abroad. This is borne out by a survey in May, in which jobs portal JobStreet found nearly 2 in 3 Singapore workers are willing to relocate abroad for work, with 72% of those willing to relocate being young professionals under the age of 30. However, a survey of 50 firms by the British Chamber of Commerce Singapore released in October found limited overseas exposure one of the most likely issues preventing the hiring of Singaporeans into senior level roles. So, what gives with this difference? Hello, I'm Tay Hong Yi. You're listening to Headstart on Record. Get a head start in your personal finance and career with us. Our guests today have navigated and are helping others to navigate this complex undertaking to work abroad. My first guest is Dr. Nadir Zafar, Chief Experience Officer at the Human Capital Leadership Institute, which aims to develop leaders and leadership in Asia. He is concurrently Director of the Singapore Leaders Network, or SGLN, an economic development board-backed networking group launched in July 2022 to help Singaporeans prepare for global corporate leadership roles. And he was also posted abroad early on in his own career. Meanwhile, my second guest is Ms. Cheryl Lin, a young professional who took the leap from a journalism role in Singapore to a master's degree at the Copenhagen Business School, and subsequently a job as a business analyst for an e-commerce logistics product. Welcome to the show, Nadir and Cheryl.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And if I may start with you, Nadir. So your position with HCLI and the Leaders Network SGLN gives you broad visibility over global talent trends and flows and the practical challenges they face in seeking global exposure. How can someone find opportunities to work abroad, and what are generally some of the pathways available that you've seen?
I think the best way that one can find those opportunities is not to wait for them, but to actually go proactively and look for them. The easiest would be to start within your company and ask your HR, ask your supervisors if any such opportunities exist in the branches of that company outside of Singapore. I think one needs to be proactive about going for these opportunities and really seeking what it is that they would like, where it is that they'd like to go.
And Cheryl, you're one of those people. You took up the pursuit of a postgraduate degree before you changed your careers totally. I was wondering if you could share with us, how did that happen? You're a live example of that happening.
Yep. So I moved to Copenhagen for a few reasons, right? I think we can classify those into push and pull. On the push side, I had been in my job as a journalist in Singapore for 5 years. I was a little tired, a little bit burnt out, but I think I also really, really wanted to try something new. And I remember something an editor told me when I first started was that she actually regretted not having tried anything else when she was younger. And that stuck with me. And I also felt, I wanted to see what else I could do and what other skills I could build. And that's for the push, right? And then on the pull side of things, ever since I was young, I've always dreamed of getting to live and work overseas. I wanted to see what else the world had to offer. And Copenhagen was kind of a serendipitous choice. I lived here on exchange as an undergraduate, and back then I chose it because I'd never been to Scandinavia, but I had heard all these great things about it, right? And then I got to experience for myself when I lived here how safe it was, how good the infrastructure was. People are super open-minded, and I'd say the standard of living is really high. And after that experience on exchange, I said, yeah, I could see myself living here. And I think a big one that needs to be mentioned is my then boyfriend and now husband is Danish Chinese. and we'd been doing long distance for many years. He lives in Copenhagen, and I wanted to close this gap. So I was really, really lucky because I got a scholarship for a master's program here. And that, kind of ticked off all the boxes, right? It combined my desire to learn something new with my desire to live overseas and what more in Copenhagen. And I think that was a huge reason why I said, yeah, let's jump into this.
And even so, I would imagine there were some challenges, trade-offs, and issues that you had to consider. I was wondering if you could walk us through some of these and how did you then weigh these in the thought process?
Yeah, for sure. So I was just thinking to myself that actually I think a lot of people over-romanticize the concept of living abroad. It sounds really fun. It is really fun, but it comes with a whole ton of drawbacks that people don't talk about enough, I think. And this could really differ from person to person. It could be the culture shock of adapting to a whole new environment, managing the bureaucracy, taxes, visas, healthcare, of living in a whole new country where nothing is familiar. It could be maintaining connections back home. The list goes on. But if I had to speak from personal experience, for me, the biggest was missing my family. And I'm hyper aware of the fact that my parents are getting older. And every day that I'm not there with them is a day that I'm missing with them. Every time I see them, and I don't get to go back that often, but every time I see them, they have more white hair. They have wrinkles I've never noticed before. And it's difficult. And it's not just the relationships with family, but my friends as well, right? With my friends back home, I know they're always there for me, but with the time difference, it gets hard to have FaceTime. And I think it's never the same as if you're in person and life goes on without you. Your friend groups still meet up, but you miss out on all the inside jokes and all the conversations that they've had. And so I think while you're chasing this goal of living overseas, sometimes and often it does come at the cost of sacrificing your connections and relationships back home. And that can be very, very difficult, especially if, you're someone who's super social and relies a lot on those connections like I am, I think.
Nadir, you've worked abroad yourself. Did what Cheryl say relate to you? Did it resonate? Was it something that you would be familiar with? Or were there other challenges maybe you could share with us as well?
I absolutely relate with what Cheryl said. I think living abroad has the challenges that she mentioned, but I was lucky in the sense that I got to go back quite often, at least twice or thrice a year. I was based in most of my 12 years of overseas work exposure has been in the United Arab Emirates, which is a 7.5-hour flight. So I benefited from the fact that I got to come back quite often.
And when you speak to both employers and talents in your current job that have to weigh these issues and have to kind of sweeten the deal on the employer side, what are some of the issues that they cite that are particularly challenging and wicked to solve?
Challenges in the sense of getting people outside of Singapore?
Yeah, both on the employer side in terms of convincing the talents to move, as well as on the talent side, the things that keep them here.
Sure. From the conversations I've had with business and HR leaders, it appears that they have trouble convincing Singaporeans to get out of the country and work outside. These challenges stem from a number of reasons that I've heard. One, the familiarity with Singapore, the fact that they're very happy here. It's a nice, comfortable place. And that's one of the reasons they're not willing to get out to a place that's not as comfortable. The second reason is, as Cheryl mentioned as well, it's the family reasons. They have parents that are aging, or they have children that are going into school. And for these family reasons, they prefer not to leave the country. It's notoriously difficult to come back to Singapore and have your child fit into the academic system here. It's something that I think has been discussed quite often amongst many people. It's what stops a lot of Singaporeans from getting out. Coming back into a system that is very rigid, unlike what they might have experienced in a school outside of Singapore, can be quite depressing for a kid who's not had that experience before. So that's the second reason, the family reasons. The third is sometimes the compensation. Moving to a country that is in the emerging world, a developing world, may result in a salary that is not on par with what you would get in Singapore. And while that salary is fantastic for the country that you're in, Singaporeans are more pragmatic and say, well, my mortgage in Singapore is the same. Whether I take the job in Singapore or go overseas, I still have to pay the same mortgage. So I wouldn't want to accept something lower, even if it is like a king's salary in that country. So these are some of the reasons that I have heard are challenges for Singaporeans moving out of the country. Another thing I've heard is that moving out is risky because then what do you come back to? That safety net may not be there. You've gone overseas, you've been there, you've done that, and then you come back and you find there's nothing quite of the level at which you were in before moving.
Yes, in Singapore, we were just talking about this before the recording, right? That it starts at a high base. Singapore is a relatively high base relative to the cost of living. And that combination is quite hard to get elsewhere in the world. With taxes, if it's not taxes, it's the compensation itself, the package itself. And these are trade-offs to consider, and you might have to consider the sort of reduction in take-home salary in the immediate term to be an investment. So I imagine that mindset is quite difficult to take root, would you say?
Absolutely. And one wonders, right, why are these problems very specific to Singaporeans? I mean, there are expats all over the world. People are traveling all the time and moving countries and working elsewhere. But why is it just particularly with Singaporeans that we have an issue? And it goes back to, I think, a couple of things. As I mentioned, the Asian culture is a little bit more family-oriented, where we want to be closer with our aging parents or with our kids, immediate family. That's one of the reasons that it makes it more specifically or uniquely a Singaporean issue. The second is our school and our schooling system. It's not a system that you can move easily in and out of. Once you're in, you're in. But once you go out for a year or two and you try to come back in, that's very difficult. You've got the second language requirement, which even if you choose not to take, and it's possible, the MOE has said, you don't have to do a second language if you come from overseas, but they immediately give you a score that is quite low because they have to assign a score for that second language that you're not doing. And that score is, in a PSLE terms, 1 is the best, 8 is the worst. The best you get is a 6. So straight off the bat, your kid is at a disadvantage. And that, I think, is a very uniquely Singaporean challenge. So, expats around the world, they're in a school which is, let's say, IB, and they move from one country to the other country. It's the same system, IB.
Yeah. And housing obligations are something that I've actually heard before as well, that this idea that there's this very normalized sense of home ownership, and to get home ownership young, you sign a BTO, there's a minimum occupation period for the built-to-order flat as well, that you have a mortgage in on it and down payment. And this contrast really, and maybe you might want to chime in here, Cheryl, because in terms of the sort of attitudes towards home ownership, because I recall that I was at a luncheon and an expatriate actually told me, and this was a guy who was quite senior, he was an APAC lead here, a GM here, and he told me the first time he owned a house was at 42 or 43 years of age, which would be unthinkable in Singapore, that sort of, because he was renting all around before his overseas stints. I was just wondering if that's something you related to as well, the sort of home ownership and versus renting. I'm not sure about your housing arrangement there in Copenhagen right now.
Yeah. What can I say? I am renting right now. And like you said, I think as Singaporeans, normally we live with our parents until we get married or whatever, and then we move out. So this is changing, of course, but typically you've never been one to spend that much on rent. And having to live overseas, you have to factor that in to what you can save as well, right? So I completely agree with what Nadir was saying as well about Singaporeans being very pragmatic about what is my take-home salary. And of course, what affects that is the tax rate in a country. And in Singapore, our taxes are quite low, and we've been used to that our whole lives. But that's actually not the norm in many parts of the world. So in Denmark, for example, you can typically expect to pay about 40% in tax. It's quite normal to pay even half your salary in tax. So sometimes at the end of the month, it's like, oh, ouch, that hurt. And I think that could be something that stops Singaporeans as well from moving overseas if they're focused on, okay, what am I earning at the end of the month? But then on the other side of things, I guess some people can also see, all right, money is just one thing, but experience-wise, what am I getting out of it? And you can't put a price on that sometimes as well. So it's a balance between those two.
Yeah, so actually on that point, Cheryl, so how do you think working abroad has benefited your career and kind of personal growth as well? You mentioned, of course, you have ties there, your partner is there, your husband, rather, is there, lives there. So maybe on both the career front and as well the personal growth front, how do you think working abroad has benefited it?
Let's start with career-wise. I think getting to work in a different cultural context has taught me a whole new world of what it can be like to have a different working environment. Over here in Denmark, the hierarchy is very flat. There's a huge emphasis on work-life balance. And I have to admit, this is not something that I was used to working in Singapore. And I think also career-wise, getting this international exposure is a huge privilege, right? It's priceless. And I think, as you mentioned earlier, overseas experience is something that employers in Singapore also really prize. So if I were to go back to Singapore, I think, this would really show my adaptability and also my ability to just work in different environments. But on the personal development side, I think I've grown a lot being out of my comfort zone. Every day you're in a different environment, an unfamiliar environment where nothing is how you're used to. You're having to constantly navigate the space. It's pretty challenging, it's pretty exhausting. And especially if you had to find a job on your own and you had to fight through that, face tons of rejections. I think it's made me more resilient overall. And like I said, I've also seen a whole new way of living where I would say in Denmark, career is not the center of my identity, but just part of it. And that, again, is something that, I didn't realize before when I was living in Singapore, that my career was kind of consuming me, right? So it's just a different way of living and different lifestyle. And I'm really glad I've got to experience that for myself. And also just the fact that I've been able to be with my partner. I don't think, if I was still in Singapore, it would have still been long distance. But yeah, I would say those two things. The first one being, constantly out of my comfort zone. And then number two, having seen a whole new way of living. Those things, personal development wise, I really, really value.
I was just wondering, you were mentioning the job search was difficult. There were a lot of rejections. I was wondering, in terms of the residency requirements and all that, was it very difficult for you to navigate that? How did you navigate that? Maybe some practical anecdotes on that front would be helpful.
Yeah, I would say, being seconded to a country by a company is the easy path. Well, not easy, but it's easier than if you were trying to strike it out on your own. That's much more difficult, right? Because then, some countries are not as open to foreigners as others may be. So I think it really helps to do your research, right? Look into the destination country's job market and see very often there's a list of professions that are in demand. And if you can see one of those aligning with what you do or what you want to do, then go in that direction because that always helps rather than going into the country and realizing the market is completely saturated and it's going to be so hard for you to find a job. I would also consider getting an education as a pathway. That's what I did. Because getting that local education can open the doors to the job market. Because often it comes also with internships or part-time work opportunities, which often then lead to full-time employment. Of course, education is also expensive. And it's a privilege. So if you can look for a scholarship, which is available in quite a few places, then that makes it more accessible. I would say just other tips is also, balance what you want with what's possible because it depends a lot on what your priority is. Because moving abroad, if that's really your number one priority, it may mean you have to take a role that doesn't fully align with your initial career goals. And you may have to accept that it's just different from what you want, or it might involve a pay cut. But yeah, if that's really what you want, then I would say go for it. Just be aware that maybe you have to be a bit more flexible with your career goals. But it is possible to have both. It just depends on how you navigate it. And the last one being just plan financially because moving abroad can be super expensive, especially if you don't have a job already lined up. So it's crucial to budget, save as much as you can beforehand because there's costs like visa fees, relocation, buying new furniture for a new apartment, all of these things. So yeah, just plan for that.
Yes, and when you were applying for jobs in Copenhagen, what was the receptiveness of the employers that, hey, I had a career in Singapore, I now have a master's and I'm looking for a job in the Danish market. How receptive were they? And how much did they value that experience from Singapore? What did they think about it? Did they share anything about that?
Yeah. To be frank, I got the sense that a lot of employers actually did not value my experience in Singapore too much. For them, they were very much focused on what have you done in Denmark? Like, oh yeah, okay, you worked in Singapore for 5 years, cool. But what have you done in Denmark? So that was kind of a challenge for me, getting them to recognize that 5 years I did work in Singapore. That was a huge part of my career that I was quite proud of, that I felt I could contribute a lot with. And I would say not all employers are that open-minded. I was super lucky that my current boss, that was something that he saw value in. And I think in the interviews I had, he was actually one of the first few employees to ask me, actually, I see you worked in Singapore. That's super interesting. Can you tell me more about that and what you did there? So I will say it's not a given that all employers are that open and receptive to foreigners and who value your overseas experience. So yeah, unfortunately.
So what about you, Nadir? Like 12 years, mostly in the United Arab Emirates and surrounding areas. How has it benefited your career as well as yourself as a person, you think?
I'd say the experience has been priceless. Prior to moving back to Singapore, I was in a company where there was no website, no product, no revenue, no customers. It was a startup in Abu Dhabi. I remember at the time when I told my parents I'm moving to this company, they tried to Google it and they couldn't find any information about this company online because it was that small of a startup. Almost 5 years later, when I left that company, it had grown to a unicorn status. It had $250 million of revenue. I was the chief operating officer looking after a company with 300 people and responsible for many of the departments, finance, legal, HR, as well as the expansion into Asia. This year, the company got listed for over $3 billion. I have no shares, but what I tell people is that the experience was priceless. What I gained in that 5 years in the UAE prior to moving back to Singapore is something that I feel is translatable and can be used across any experience that I'm in today. So what I suggest to Singaporeans is just go take the chance. I mean, not many would take the chance to go to a foreign country, to a company that doesn't even have a website, and take a job at that company. But it worked out for me, and it can work out for others. It does take a lot of hard work, no doubt, but it pays off. I think one has to be very intentional. I've had the opportunity to be both seconded by a company in Singapore to work overseas, as well as hustle my way into finding a job overseas without being seconded. So I've tried both options. I can tell you that they're both relatively difficult, but doable. For the company in Singapore, the reason I chose to work in that company was simply because they had an overseas rotation program guaranteed at the end of the first year. But when they got to the point where they offered me that overseas posting, it was to countries that I wasn't quite interested in going to. And I had to ask them to move me to India, a place that I had never worked in, but I wanted to just try my hand at a very difficult market. And initially they said no, but after some negotiation, I found some work for myself to do in the company in India, and they posted me there. And I can say that the 1 year there in India was just such a great learning experience, to be in an environment that is absolutely different from what I'm familiar with. So there was intention in that posting to India. The second time was when I had just graduated from my MBA, and I happened to be in transit in Dubai, a place that I had never prior been to. But while in Dubai, I took the opportunity to look through the alumni database of that university I had gone to, the business school. I found someone or some people that I thought would be interesting to talk to. I emailed them. Lo and behold, one of them replied back saying, "Come over and let's chat." He wasn't in town. He said, "Just come and meet my HR." And I did. And they offered me 2 positions. They said, "We have 2 options. Would you like to work here?" And I was quite surprised at the speed at which things happened. I then ended up working in the UAE a month later. That was my first stint in the UAE. I moved back to Singapore subsequently. And then I took on another role in Abu Dhabi with that company which had absolutely no website and no product. I can say that if I were to summarize doing business in Singapore and doing business outside of Singapore, I would summarize it this way. Doing business in Singapore is like riding a tricycle with a helmet on a smooth paved road with a road sign, a traffic light, and someone there to make sure that everything is in order. Doing business outside of Singapore is like riding a mountain bike on the edge of a very rocky cliff. You're precariously hanging on for dear life. It's extremely foggy. There are no road signs and you've got no helmet. And you just got to find your way through that. that's how I would describe doing business in Singapore and outside.
And, across all that time, was there anything you felt like, oh, it would have been great if Singapore could have provided more support in to make this jump more palatable? Because right now, I think what we're seeing for surveys and so on is that people are generally open to the idea, but when it comes to the practicalities, there's a bit of cold feet. So what are the areas in which we can create more support in to close that gap?
That's a great question. And I can tell you it's the fear of the unknown that puts people off these overseas adventures. You don't know what you don't know. And I think what will really help is to be part of a community that has been there and done that. Because then when you share and relate and listen to what others have experienced, you somehow feel less scared of the unknown. It starts to open up to say, wow, like for example, now I hear from Cheryl that it is manageable. She's managed to get a job in Denmark. And she did it without being seconded from a company in Singapore. She had to find it on her own. It is possible. And I think just letting people understand that these possibilities exist is enough to make them less scared. I also feel that a community aside, one needs to have a bit of intention behind the whole overseas assignment. Before you go, there are certain things that you should do. While you're there are certain things and communities or people that you should connect with. And when you come back, it's always nice to be in the company of people who've also returned so they can share stories of how they got their kids through the education or how they managed to reintegrate back into our society. That, I think, is something that probably we can be a bit more focused on building to make it much more exciting for Singaporeans to take on those overseas assignments.
And before the recording, you were just sharing with me some very interesting anecdotes about what some of the leaders are saying in terms of the difficulty of getting Singaporeans abroad and some of the pain points.
So a couple of years back, prior to me being in this particular role, while I was in the UAE, I would only listen to sound bites about what's happening in Singapore because I was based overseas. And the sound bites I heard in general was simply companies here are biased and not hiring Singaporeans in top management. And that was generally the messaging that I heard many kilometers away, many thousands of miles away in the UAE. And then I came back to Singapore. I took on this role. And I can tell you that I think that's quite far from the truth. Having now spoken to many business and HR leaders, I feel that there's a genuine desire from companies to want to promote Singaporeans into top roles. There is a genuine desire. The problem is they don't have enough Singaporeans that they can select for such roles. And then when I question them why not, they say, well, the kind of people we're looking for, somehow the Singaporeans don't meet that criteria. And then when I dig deeper and say, what are you looking for? More often than not, what they're looking for is someone who has had that overseas work exposure. That is critical for one to take on a regional or global leadership role. Why? Because once somebody does business outside of Singapore and goes through that experience and builds up the resilience, builds up the creative thinking, builds up their capacity to think beyond what they know, I think that's when people have the ability to take on top management roles. So now that we know that that's the issue, getting people to go overseas and work, the question is, why aren't we doing more of that? And so companies are telling me they try, but as we said earlier in this recording, Singaporeans are very pragmatic. You want me to go overseas? Well, hey, I got elderly parents. I got a spouse who's working. I got kids in school. I have all these things to consider. I've got a mortgage to pay. What's going to happen to all of that? If I go overseas, my husband or my wife may not get a job overseas, and we're a dual income family. My kids may go overseas for a couple of years, but when they come back, I can't afford to put them in international school because they can't fit into the local system. So then what? International schools are very expensive, 30, 40K a year. Local schools are $100 a year. So it's these pragmatic considerations that prevent Singaporeans from wanting to go overseas. And of course, the fear of the unknown. Like you put me in Indonesia, oh my gosh, that's like a hardship location. Not really, we're not posting people to like rural parts of Indonesia. Jakarta is a fabulous city, and so are the capitals of the ASEAN countries around. The other thing I want to share is that Singaporeans, and this is something that Professor Lily Kong from SMU has said in an opinion piece in the Straits Times in 2022, and these are her words, not mine. She wrote, Singaporeans have a misguided sense of superiority when it comes to the region. And one of the reasons for that is they go outside of Singapore and they go to villages around the region and they start building toilets or building huts, helping underprivileged. And that's all very good. But when they come back, they get the feeling that we're better than those countries. And that's not the case. When we compare ourselves with the average of the countries around us, no doubt as a city-state, we look much more advanced. So I think we got to just remember that there's a lot to learn from the region.
Then, Cheryl, you said something very interesting just now. You said that in Denmark, you had this feeling that you are less defined by your career. So I was just wondering, what else then defines you, you feel, more so than in Singapore?
Yeah. So whenever I meet someone new in Denmark, or let's say whenever I used to meet someone new in Singapore, I think the first thing that always comes out is, oh, what do you do? But here in Denmark, I find often the conversation is more like, oh, yeah, nice to meet you. What are you interested in? What do you do in your free time? What are your hobbies? And that was so refreshing to me. I was like, oh, wait, you don't want to know about what I do? Oh, are you sure? And yes, so I would say it's, yeah, like I mentioned, all those things, the things that you do in your free time. What are your interests? What are your passions, your hobbies? What beliefs do you have? What causes do you stand for? Those things tend to define you more than your job. And over the dinner table, I would say we don't really talk about, jobs that much and what's happening at work. We talk about what's happening in our personal lives. Yeah, so I would say in that sense, would define less by work. And also the work-life balance is amazing over here in Denmark. One of the things that first shocked me when I moved here was that when I was on the metro or, going home, at the peak hour, as stated, in the metro, they said the peak hour was between 3 to 4 p.m. or something. I was like, this would never happen in Singapore. So every day between 3 to 4 p.m., you see a whole rush of Danes going home. But in Singapore, I think that's more like 6 to 7.
Yeah.
So it's always funny to see that. Yeah.
So actually on that point then, this is my last question to the both of you. First to you, Cheryl, would you ever come back to Singapore? Why and why not? And then later on after that for Nadir, why did you decide to come back? Because I think that's a very kind of clear contrast that we're seeing here. And I think that's interesting for us to delve deeper into.
Yeah, that's such a difficult question. It's so hard to answer because there's so many moving pieces of that uncertainty, right? If I go back to Singapore, what will I do there? Will I have a job there? Will it be difficult for me to find something again after having been overseas for a few years? But let's look at the why yes, I would go back, and why no. So why yes, I miss my family and my friends. I miss the food. Oh, the food.
How's the state of Singapore food there?
Non-existent. Non-existent, but I'm surviving with my ready-made laksa paste and chicken rice paste. Doesn't hit the same, but yeah, it's the best I can do. But okay, why I would also move back to Singapore is I would say Singapore is actually, it has a super dynamic employment market. It's the HQ for so many MNCs. There's tons of career opportunities. It's so global. And I think this is something I took for granted when I was living there. And also only now having been out of the country, when I talk about the fact that I'm from Singapore, then everyone is always like, oh, wow, Singapore, that's a great place to be. You have so many this, the companies there. And I was like, you're right. Why did it only take me having to move somewhere to see that? And also Singapore is very forward thinking, in terms of things like, let's say, Web3, blockchain, AI. It supports innovation very readily and is an exciting place to be. And that's not a given for all countries. Also, just the last thing, it's super convenient to live there. You have everything that you need at your fingertips. As for the why not, as I just talked about, the work-life balance in Denmark is amazing. And I don't think I could get the same in Singapore right now. Things might change, but as it is, I see quite a big difference. The pace of life here is also generally more chill. And as I mentioned, there's a focus on life outside of work. The work culture here is also really good because there's a lot of flexibility and trust in employees. The hierarchy is really flat, as I said earlier. And mental health is taken very, very seriously here. For example, you can go to your doctor and say, I'm stressed, and he will, say, yeah, then take a few days off of work. You tell that to your boss, and your boss says, oh, I'm so sorry to hear that. Yeah, definitely take a break if you're stressed. Let's, get better, focus on getting better. And also, time off is pretty generous here. You get about a minimum of 5 weeks. So those are some reasons why and why not. But ultimately, let's see what happens. I have no idea what's going to happen in the future. So yeah, it just depends.
What about you, Nadir? So on the flip side, what made you decide to come back after 12 years cumulatively abroad?
For me, it was very clear. Family was the driver. And for me, it was parents and my kids. I wanted to come back to be closer to home. I wanted my kids to go into the primary one. I did come back a little earlier than necessary. My kids were 4 when I moved back. Primary one is only when they're 7. But on reflection, I realized I did the right thing by coming back a bit earlier, particularly because it got me to spend more time with my family here. So I think it was a good, clear reason to come back to Singapore. The food, not really the food, because I had lots of Singaporean food in the UAE. I found all the Singaporean restaurants and I ate at every single one of them multiple times. But of course, the food in Singapore is so much more authentic.
Actually, can I just say something as well?
Sure, yeah.
Earlier on, Nadir, you had this analogy of, what it's like to do business in Singapore and do business outside of it. Doing business in Singapore, smooth paved roads, road signs telling you exactly where to go. And overseas, super unknown, super dangerous. You have no idea where you're going. I would say that analogy in my head applies not just to doing business in Singapore and outside, but living in Singapore and living outside. Living in Singapore, I would say maybe sometimes a path is quite clearly defined for you. You get married, you BTO, children, career, you climb the corporate ladder. It's safe. And on the other hand, living overseas, you don't know where you're going. You don't know what you're doing half the time. It's super difficult. You're like, but the view is pretty amazing on the right.
That's absolutely true. I'm going to share 2, at the sound of sounding corny, there are 2 phrases that are slogans, right? One is no pain, no gain. And the other is winning is not comfortable. I know it's cheesy as the boats sound, but it's so true. And I've heard this from business leaders, and I've asked business leaders, how did you get to where you are? And one business leader in particular who comes from a neighboring country said to me, in the country he's from, every day is a fight. Every day is a struggle. Every day is dealing with complete chaos. Like the train is not working, the bus doesn't come, things break down. And he said that built him up as a person. That made him stronger, more resilient, more ready to accept things that don't go your way. And he said when he moved to Singapore, he said to me, I found that people broke down very easily here. The moment things didn't go their way, it's like, oh, now what? Whereas for him and people from his country, it was the norm. You deal with it. So I think that's just one anecdote. Another is when I was working in India and I was at a meeting, there was 20 people on the table and the guy making a presentation was talking. Suddenly the light went out. And I'm with all my Singaporean colleagues and we all looked at each other saying, oh no. But the guy continued the presentation as though nothing happened. And in Singapore, we wouldn't do that because we'd wonder what's going on. It's just so not normal for the electricity to just go off. But in India, it's normal. You deal with it. You move on. And another story, like when you're in another country, even the UK, the trains break down all the time. They'll tell you this station is no longer, go to the other station. People just get up and move. No complaints, no whatever, they just move. They know that this is the things to expect. Whereas in Singapore, it's all about, oh no. So I think we've come to be a bit spoiled, which is, it's part and parcel of living in such a wonderful place. But we got to recognize that that's why we got to get out of Singapore and experience the real world so that we can build up our own sense of resilience and grit.
Thanks for that, Nadir and Cheryl. What I really enjoyed about this recording was that we've shown really very clearly kind of the both sides of the coin, how the grass is greener, how it may not always be greener, to use another corny cliche. And it is on this note we end this 6th episode of Headstart on Record. Thank you, Cheryl and Nadir, for sharing your insights into working abroad. It was a pleasure to have both of you on our show. I'm Tay Hong Yi, and if you have any hot takes or sticky questions about working overseas, do email me. If you'd like to read my articles and the Headstart newsletter, or find me on LinkedIn, all these links are in our podcast show notes. I've linked my colleague Kai Xiang's story as well. This episode is edited by Amiru Karim. Thanks for listening.
Send your feedback to podcast@sph.com.sg. Find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or within our Straits Times app. Thanks for listening. Do note, all analyses, opinions, recommendations, and other information in this podcast are for general information purposes only and are not intended to be relied upon as financial advice. You should not rely on them in making any decision. Please consult a fully qualified financial advisor or professional expert for independent advice and verification. To the fullest extent permitted by law, SPH Media shall not be liable for any loss arising from the use of or reliance on any analyses, opinions, recommendations, and other information in this podcast. SPH Media accepts no responsibility or liability whatsoever that may result or arise from the products, services, or information of any third parties. All opinions expressed by participants in this podcast are solely their own and do not reflect the opinions of SPH Media.